Hi, you're watching BK Hobby, and this is the openHAB Basics series, in which I'll show you how to completely start using openHAB and configure your own home automation system. Now, in the last video, I showed you how to install openHAB on your Raspberry Pi using openHABing. I also recommended that you set up the demo configuration so that you will have a basic interface to start learning with. Now, what the demo version of openHAB does is it creates configuration files that define this basic user interface, define the items that you see here, and will allow you to change the configuration to see exactly how openHAB works. The entire configuration is set up using text files, so we need to be able to edit those text files to make any changes. There's a couple ways you can edit those files. First, you can use PuTTY and connect to your Raspberry Pi via SSH. The configuration files are stored in etc openHAB2, so we will type in cd /etc /openHAB2 and hit enter. If you type ls in here, you will see there are several folders that store different configuration files, and we will eventually talk what these different folders and file types mean, but that is a topic for the next video. In the meantime, I'll show you some of the most important ones. For example, in the services folder, you have different configuration files for the add-ons, logging, and even the user interfaces. We'll get back up out of that one. In the items folder, we see the first demo.items file. This will be one of the files that we would edit to change these items like switches, dimmers, charts, etc. In the sitemaps folder, you also see a demo.sitemap file, and that defines the layout and grouping of all the items you see within your basic UI. And in the rules folder, you see demo.rules, which defines actions to take when you, for example, change the position of a switch or a dimmer on the sitemap. So how do you edit these files? Well, you could use VI if you're a glutton for punishment. Wait, how do you get out of this thing again? Oh yeah, I forgot. You have to hit Shift : and type Q. So we're not going to do that. You could also use nano, which is a text editor that's built into the openHABing image. So sudo nano demo.rules. I'll need to type in the superuser password, openHABing, and that opens the nano editor. With the openHABing image, the nano text editor will nicely highlight all the different syntax within your rules file, for example. And it's a fairly easy text editor once you get used to it. Just remember to hit the control key when to select any of the options down here below. And for example, if I make a change here, you'll notice the modified text comes up here. So when I try to exit, when I hit Control X, it'll ask me to save any changes. I'll type in yes, file name to write, the same one, hit enter. So nano is easy enough for small changes to the text files. But copying and pasting large amounts of code is kind of painful, and you definitely end up missing some of the features that you're used to seeing with Windows Editor. So we're not going to use SSH to edit any of our configuration files. So I'll type in exit here. And if you remember, I mentioned that openHABing sets up a Samba Share that allows you to access the files on your Raspberry Pi directly. So we'll open up Windows Explorer. And in the address window, we'll type in the IP address of our Raspberry Pi. When you hit enter, you'll notice that two shared network folders come up. One is specific to the configuration files that are stored for openHAB, and the other is a general share for the runtime files, logging, etc. So we're going to access the openHAB configuration shared folder. Double click on it and enter the same credentials we used in PuTTY. So openHABing for the username and openHABing for the password. And what you'll notice is that we now have access to the same folders we saw in PuTTY. And if I double click on items, I see that items file that we saw before. And the cool thing is from here you can use any text editor you like to edit this file. But by far the best editor I've found for openHAB is Visual Studio Code. Mostly because it's a dedicated code editor, but also because there's an extension that was written by openHAB developers that allows you to interface with your openHAB setup directly. So what we're going to do next is we're going to set up Visual Studio Code. I will download the version for Windows and I will install it on my computer. I want to create a desktop icon so it's easy to access. And I'll also add the Open with Code action to my Windows Explorer file context menu. That way, when I right-click on the file in Windows Explorer, the option to edit it with Visual Studio Code will show up right here. Hit Next and hit Install. This will take a couple minutes, and once it's done, I have the option to launch Visual Studio Code. I want to do that, so I'll leave the checkbox checked and hit Finish. The first time Visual Studio Code starts up, it's going to give me the release notes for the current version and the welcome screen. So the first thing I want to do once I'm here is install the openHAB extension. I'll click on the Extensions tab, and I will type in openHAB in the search box. openHAB comes up right here. Click on openHAB and select Install. Again, this will take a couple minutes. And once it's finished, you will need to reload Visual Studio Code to activate the extension. So hit Reload, and you will now notice the openHAB extension is enabled. So in order to use all of the features within the openHAB extension, like syntax highlighting, like the ability to preview your user interfaces directly within Visual Studio Code, or access items within your openHAB configuration, you will need to point the extension at your openHAB server. So for that, we need to go into the Visual Studio Code settings. Click on the settings icon here in the lower left corner, select settings, and this will open up the user settings window. Within the settings window, we want to go to the openHAB specific section. So type in openHAB, and this will only show the openHAB configuration settings. Now if you followed my first video and you installed openHABian on the Raspberry Pi, this host setting here that points at your openHAB server doesn't have to change. You can just leave it set to openHABian Pi. But if your openHAB is installed on a different machine, you will need to type in the IP address here. In my case, because I don't want to access my production server, I will need to type in the IP address of the Raspberry Pi I used in my previous video. So in order to change this default user setting, I'm going to need to override it within this window next to it. So I'll type in openHAB dot, and you'll notice that all the possible settings auto-populate. The setting I want to change is host, so I'll click that one. And now I can change the value to whatever I need it to be. So I will type in my demo openHAB's IP address. And you will notice that the Explorer window now has a notification telling me that there is an unsaved modified file. So I can either save this file individually by right-clicking it, selecting Save, or I can just click this icon for saving all of the files. And now my user settings are saved, and my Visual Studio Code should be accessing my Raspberry Pi directly. I'll close out user settings, and also close out this extension description window. So now I need to open the files on my Raspberry Pi in order to edit them. The quickest way to do it is just hit this Open Folder button and type in the address of the Raspberry Pi that we're looking at in the Explorer window. But there is a better way to configure this so that we don't have to type in that address every time. And for that, I will go back into our Explorer window and open the openHAB configuration folder I showed you before. And what we will do is map this as a network drive. So click on Home, Easy Access, and click this Map as Drive option. Select the drive letter. In this case, I'm okay with Y. And in the folder text box, we will go back into the Explorer window, click here, and copy this address string. I will paste that address into this text box here. Make sure Reconnect at Sign-In is checked, and hit Finish. And now you see that this openHAB configuration folder is mapped as the Y drive. And it's available for me to access from Windows Explorer. And we'll go back into Visual Studio Code and select Open Folder one more time. Now I can select the folder we just mapped as a network drive, which is Y, and hit the Select Folder button. And that opens up the entire folder in Visual Studio Code. And I can easily access every configuration file from Visual Studio Code. For example, if I open the Items folder and click on Demo Items, that opens up the Items file. And you will notice there's very pretty syntax highlighting in the Visual Studio Code editor as well. What's really nice about this setup is the auto-completion. So for example, if I want to create a new switch, I will type in switch, and as you type in the first letter of the item name, for example, L, all of the items that are configured already pop up. Another neat thing about Visual Studio Code and the openHAB extension is the templates. So for example, if I type in I here and select item, it creates a template for me that defines an item in openHAB. You'll notice it's very similar to one of these switch items here that were previously defined. but we'll talk more about what all these things mean in the next video. Let's make one easy change so I can show you how editing files in Visual Studio Code affects your openHAB setup. So for example, if I take the switch here and change the text from terrace to patio, again, you'll notice I have one unsafe file because I've been editing this items file. If I hit the save all icon and go back into the openHAB basic UI, if I click on garden, you'll notice the change was immediate. As soon as I make the change in Visual Studio Code and save the file, openHAB reloads the items configuration file. This is also true for several other configuration types in openHAB. Another thing I want to show you is the preview window within Visual Studio Code. So if I open up my sitemap file, which defines the user interface, and if I click this openHAB icon here in the upper right corner, Visual Studio Code will open up a browser window right within the program. So I can easily make changes to my sitemap configuration here. For example, let's just change the name here from first floor to second floor. And again, if I hit save all, you'll notice the browser refreshed and the user interface changed immediately. So as you see, Visual Studio Code is a full-featured openHAB editor. It really makes the job of changing your openHAB configuration much easier and allows you to see your changes on the fly. So I'm going to stop right here for now. In the next video, we'll get further into what the different configuration items within openHAB actually mean. For example, things, sitemaps, rules, items, or transforms. But I hope this video helped you set up an editor environment that you can use to make changes to your openHAB configuration. If you like this video, go ahead and subscribe so you can be notified of future videos in the series. And as always, thank you for watching. This is BK Hobby.